Well, have you ever been stalked? A lot of us might joke about, stalking someone online, looking at pictures of an ex, maybe someone you've got a crush on. Stalking, however, is no laughing matter. And if you've been the victim of any serious stalking behaviour, you'll know how frightening and unsettling it can be. And too often, stalking leads to a line being crossed into violence. Remember the example of Hannah Clark and her 3 children who were set on fire and murdered by Hannah's estranged ex-husband, Rowan Baxter. He'd been engaged in stalking behaviour in the lead up to their deaths in Brisbane in 2020. Nicole Madigan is a journalist who was stalked for 3 years by a woman that her new partner, now her husband, had a brief fling with sometime earlier. Over the time, the behaviour included text and online messages, online posts making fun of her, and implied physical stalking. It's not a traditional picture of stalking that some of us might have. It took some time for Nicole to understand that she was a stalking victim and for police to finally charge the perpetrator with the crime of stalking. Nicole's written her story in a book called Obsession. Hi, Nicole, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So take me back to the first time that you met the woman who you called Carissa in Obsession, this woman who ended up stalking you for 3 years.
So, in fact, I never officially met her. I did come across her once, about a year before I first heard from her. Just did a little catch-up where there was some mutual friends there. But it wasn't until I'd been dating my partner for several months before I got the first flurry of messages from her. And in fact, initially, I did not know who they were from.
So what kinds of messages were you getting?
They came after we'd had posted a couple of photos online. We'd had our first sort of joint function with an event that we'd hosted together.
You'd become Facebook official.
Yeah, we'd become Facebook official, that's right. And someone had clearly let her know. And I got a flurry of messages that night, which I probably can't repeat on radio, but they were very explicit. They were quite vulgar and crass and cruel. And they did make it very clear that it was someone who had dated or had some sort of relationship with my partner, although at that point I didn't know who. But within a couple of weeks, she made her identity quite clear.
And so was she using her real name, or was she switching identities and changing up, who these messages were coming from?
So the very first message was a fake account using a play on words with my partner's name. But within a week or two of that, she was using her personal account, and she used that quite openly. She wasn't trying to hide who she was. And when I blocked that account, she then went on to create a whole series of other accounts in her real name, as well as in fake names, but still making it clear who she was.
Yeah, so you said you can't repeat a lot of the stuff on the radio, but this was, the language was kind of, violent. It was kind of filthy language and just intimating all sorts of things about you, and your partner?
Yes. Initially, it was very much about both of us, and she was contacting both of us. And over time, that sort of fixation and obsession sort of seemed to have left him behind and very much stuck with me.
And what, you were the person who'd taken him away? Is that what it was?
I suppose so. I mean, they clearly weren't together when I started dating him. And she wasn't someone that I even thought about or really knew about. Certainly not someone I thought about. So it took me quite by surprise. So it's one of those things that you just don't know what the mindset is.
So how did this escalate over the years? This behaviour that started as sending you these messages, through Messenger, I think. How what else happened?
So over the first 6 months, it was all messenger-based, coming from many different angles. She contacted my mother as well, and my ex-husband, which caused, all sorts of drama in itself, because sort of her basis for those messages was a lot of lie-telling, which can cause a lot of trouble. So that continued to happen for several months until she eventually stole my identity online and started sending messages on my behalf and screenshotting them. And that was the first time I contacted police at that point.
What did the police say?
That first encounter with the police, their suggestion to me was not to make an official report because it can escalate things. And they advised me to write her an email and warn her that I would escalate things legally if it didn't stop. And I took that advice and I did that. And it did, in fact, stop for several months before starting up again escalating more rapidly and more intensely after that.
And it kind of shifted form in that she would use what I think her Instagram page to post about you.
Yes. So when she sort of returned, it started off with text messages, and then one day I was sort of minding my own business and I got a notification that I'd been tagged in an Instagram post, and I had a look, and of course it was this really disgusting image. My name was included and my accounts were tagged, and there was quite a warning on there that you'll be hearing more from me. So that was the first time things went public, and I started to panic, and from there those posts continued very, very frequently for many, many months.
How did you feel during all of this time?
Really terrified and really overwhelmed, but at the same time not knowing whether those feelings were justified because it was also distasteful and crass. It's not something you want to talk about. I didn't want to draw attention to it. I didn't want anyone to see those posts. I certainly didn't want to be identified or have my partner identified. But at the same time, it's playing with your mind because it's so continuous and you don't know when it's going to come or where it's going to come from or who's going to be contacted.
Right.
So you can be quite consumed with that anxiety and almost develop a return obsession yourself because you become so paranoid.
Because as a freelance journalist, you would use your website for looking for work. So you needed your name in public to be sort of, clean, I guess.
Well, that's right.
Not associated.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's quite easy to, and in fact, eventually I was identified and somebody did contact me about it. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise because that person helped me get this charge over the line. But it's still quite a scary feeling when you have been identified from such horrible content.
Nicole Madigan is with me. Her book is called Obsession. And a lot of people listening to this, in fact, may go, well, that doesn't really sound like stalking. That just sounds like some annoying messages. And it took you some time, I think, to really tweak that you were being stalked.
That's right, because you sort of do think, I can handle this myself, but in fact I didn't because I didn't do anything. I took that approach that ignoring it would make it go away, but it didn't go away. It continued to escalate, and as time went on, aside from the personal anguish that I was feeling and the fear of my reputation and my relationships and my work, things began to change and become more personal, and eventually she did start to post. She posted my address online and the date and venue of my upcoming wedding and some other personal information. She alluded to having moved to my suburb. So it started to become quite scary.
Felt like there was
a
potential physical threat there in a way.
That's right, yeah. You just didn't know and you always felt like you were being watched.
Yeah. So what finally did end up making the difference for you in being able to get a charge laid?
So prior to getting the charge laid, I had called on police one additional time who told me, no fault to theirs, I don't think, but they did tell me, go away, keep a diary and call 000 if it gets worse. Eventually, because she posted my address, I think that sent me into a bit of a panic. But I also took a different approach. I made a cyber report, which enabled me to write a really detailed account that covered 3 years. I think when you go into the police station, it's very hard to articulate 3 years worth of stalking, especially when it's been delivered in that sort of a way online. It's quite hard to articulate. So I put it all in writing, and I'm a writer by trade, so that was an advantage to me. And that got moved to the police station near my home, and it went forward that way.
And eventually she was charged with stalking.
She was charged with stalking. And look, the policewoman that assisted me was incredibly supportive and helpful. She guided me through the process because, of course, you have to provide the evidence for them. But she was incredibly helpful and supportive. And yes, she eventually charged her with unlawful stalking, and ultimately she pleaded guilty to that charge.
And what was the sentence?
The sentence was a 2-year probation order, and a 2-year restraining order was given to me. And that second, the restraining order was the suggestion of the judge, who took it very seriously as well. So I was very fortunate because not everything is taken seriously.
Nicole Madigan is here. Now, Nicole, if I could just cycle back, you talked about at first wanting to handle the situation yourself, and it was frightening that this was in the book, but one of the reasons you didn't go to the police at the very outset was because you were advised by a lawyer friend that a restraining order could backfire. What had that person explained to you about how they can backfire?
Well, the reason given for that was that if it doesn't go ahead, if what you're trying to do doesn't go ahead, it can just inflame that person and they can become more angry. And in fact, we know that when we look at domestic violence, even when there is a domestic violence order put in place, that can sometimes trigger a more serious or a more violent outcome. And unfortunately, reality reflects that, as is the case with Hannah, as you mentioned before.
Yeah, you wrote in the book that often the first act of actual violence comes after the DVO has been applied.
That's right. That happens in many cases.
Yeah, just amazing stuff. So we don't take this kind of stalking seriously enough, do we? And I know that even after there was a story in the local newspaper about what had happened to you, a lot of the comments were sort of like, oh, this is a silly thing. It didn't deserve to be taken seriously.
That's right. And I think especially, when you factor in there's two women involved, I hate to say it, I think people sort of can take a more humorous, approach to that, two women squabbling or it's a cat fight. It's very difficult to talk about and get people to take seriously, but in fact it is quite serious.
Now, you ended up researching a lot about the psychology of stalking as you wrote the book. You talked to a number of victims of different types of stalking. How does the prevalence of stalking break down according to gender? Who's more likely to commit it? Who's most likely to be the victim? So
men are very much more likely to be the perpetrator and women are more likely to be the victim or the victim survivor, which is probably no surprise. It's similar to domestic violence. The experts suggested that those numbers might be, might not quite reflect reality because I think, men are less likely to report these things and women perpetrators are often less likely to be taken seriously. But there is a difference.
Yeah, so I'd imagine if you had a man experiencing the same kind of thing you did from a woman, that man might well think, no, this isn't stalking or I'm not going because I'm embarrassed about it.
Well, that's right. You sort of think you can handle it yourself. And even in my case, probably I would have taken action sooner had it been a man.
Yeah, they would have seemed much clearer, yeah. Nicole, there are 5 types of stalkers. Carissa fits into the category of a resentful stalker. What's a resentful stalker?
So a resentful stalker is someone who's basically angry and out for revenge. So I spoke to Professor Paul Mullen about this, and he's the one that developed those 5 types of stalking. So a resentful stalker is just angry and they want revenge. You've done something to them in their mind and they want you to pay for that.
But they're not so likely to actually turn violent, are they?
So the research shows they're less likely to turn violent, but they're more likely to be ongoing, so have longer periods of stalking, and their method might be to damage your reputation or to just make your life difficult.
So what are the other types then?
So the other types are the rejected stalker, which is by far the most common type, and these are the types that we see in domestic violence situations often. So they've been rejected by a partner. They may have been rejected by even a medical professional or some other sort of relationship, but their motivation with their stalking is to either get the person back or get the relationship back, or they may become angry if they don't get that relationship back. But they are the most common, and there is also quite a high risk of violence in that group.
And then there's something called the intimacy seeker, and these are the people who sort of imagine that they've got some close relationship with a person they don't even know.
Yeah, so you see this type of stalker in a lot of movies, I think, if you think of 1 Hour Photo or The Fanatic with John Travolta, where they believe that they care about the person and their stalking and harassment of that person is done with the purpose of helping them in their mind. And of course, when that person doesn't reciprocate those feelings, they can become quite angry and lash out. So there is some danger there, and it is likely to go on a longer period of time.
We might look at that man who broke into, I think, Queen Elizabeth's bedroom years ago at Buckingham Palace. He sort of thought he had a relationship with her, didn't he?
That's right, yes. They believe that there's something there, and often, in many cases, the person is someone they don't even really have access to. So they're not even in the same circles, or there's sort of no realistic chance that relationship would be possible.
And Nicole, then there's a group called the incompetent suitor. Who are they?
So there are some similarities between those two, but this is someone who's probably not after a long-term relationship. They haven't got genuine feelings, but they've set a target on someone they may want to date or to take that person home, and they're determined to have that happen. So they might, hit on someone at a bar or something like that, get turned down, and then they have a flurry of very aggressive attacks, or stalking attacks. So that might be over a couple of weeks, but it's very intense and it's short-lived.
And then finally, the predator.
So the predator, again, appears in a lot of movies, and I think it's what many of us think about when we think about a stalker. So their identity is usually not known. And they may be more of a physical stalker, so they might be at your home, they're hiding in the bushes, they're looking through your window. And in many cases, in real life, these people would probably be seeking to perpetrate an physical attack eventually.
So, Nicole, how well situated are our laws at the moment to cover the gamut of stalking behaviours?
Look, there are laws there, but it's the way... The way we get to a conviction is the difficulty. I think from what the experts told me, police are under-resourced and under-trained when it comes to the nuances of stalking, which is that patterned behaviour, because often the behaviours that constitute stalking are not illegal in themselves. So in isolation, they're not illegal.
Someone sending you a message on Messenger is not illegal.
It's not illegal. And even being mean to someone is not illegal. Similar to coercive control, I suppose. It's that pattern of behaviour that inflicts fear over time. So I think police need to have a better understanding of this and maybe, take some note from some other countries like the Netherlands who really have a good response to stalking that takes into account that pattern of behaviour.
Now, Nicole, before we let you go, you do just want to flag that you've got a talk on tonight.
Yes, I'll be in conversation with Suzanne tonight at Better Read Than Dead bookshop.
All right, what time's that happening?
That starts at 6:30.
All right. Nicole, thank you so much for coming in and explaining to us absolutely compelling and very frightening read. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nicole Madigan, and her book is called Obsession.
Drive
What's your inflation indicator?
with Richard Glover.
Toasted sandwiches at the ABC.